Hello and welcome everyone to the second panel discussion of day 2 of the Reimagining Climate Adaptation Summit. My name is Dr. Tayanah O'Donnell and I'm the Director of Future Earth Australia, based here at the Australian Academy of Science in Canberra. We've got people from all over the world with us today in the virtual room, so I'd like to open up this webinar by taking a moment to acknowledge traditional owners from all around Australia and wherever you may be. For us here at the Academy of Science, we are on Ngunnawal country, and we pay respects to our elders past, present and emerging. I hope you have all had the chance to see the excellent opening plenary this morning by Dr. Marcelo Mina Carrasco, which set the scene for our discussions today. And I hope you've also been able to tune into our first panel, where we discussed a range of considerations in relation to climate adaptation finance and tackling climate risk. For this session, we have an excellent lineup of panelists who will offer a range of perspectives on enabling action for adaptation to climate change. Specifically, this session will explore who does what and how. So without further ado, I'll now introduce our 4 panelists. Our first speaker up today is Adrian Turner, who is the CEO of the Minderoo Fire and Flood Resilience Initiative. That initiative is a collaborative program applying a missions innovation model with an integrated work program of 70 projects to lift resilience so that communities can bounce back stronger from national disasters, like the devastating 2019-2020 summer fires. Prior to this, Adrian was the founding CEO of CSIRO's Data 61 project, the digital and data specialist of the National Science Agency, after spending 18 years in Silicon Valley. Thanks for joining us, Adrian. Then we will have Mark Crosweller. Mark has 36 years of experience in crisis, national security and emergency management, leading major strategic reform in governance, strategy, policy, operations and capability. Between 2012 and 2019, Mark was responsible for briefing the Prime Minister and Cabinet on disaster management and providing strategic policy advice on climate and disaster risk reduction and resilience. Mark is now the founder and director of Ethical Intelligence and a senior advisor to KPMG, advising on climate, disaster risk and leadership ethics. He is also currently finalising his PhD research on the ethical premise of leading people through the adversity and loss of disasters. Following Mark, we will then hear from Kate Mackenzie. Kate is an independent consultant who advises organisations pursuing the Paris Agreement goals on climate change, particularly in relation to finance and economics, strategy and communication. Kate is a regular contributor for Bloomberg Green, where she writes the Stranded Assets column. Kate was formerly Director of Finance, Policy and Decision Metrics at Climate Kick Australia, and before that, Head of Finance and Investment at the Climate Institute. Kate has worked as a financial journalist, winning awards at the Financial Times and at the Australian. And rounding out our panel today, last but certainly not least, is Simon Holmes. Simon is a senior advisor to the Climate and Energy College at Melbourne University. He sits on the board of the Smart Energy Council and is a regular contributor for Guardian Australia. Simon has been a pioneering force in the Australian community power movement as the founding chair of Hepburn Wind, the country's first community-owned wind farm, and is a director of the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you panellists. We are all looking forward to what will be a very interesting conversation. So we will hear from each of our panellists for 10 minutes each, and then all of us in the virtual room will have a discussion among the speakers, taking questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Adrian Turner. Thanks very much, Adrian.
Thanks very much, and also for the opportunity to speak with the group here. What I'd like to talk about and share is the principle of focusing on resilience, and particularly resilience to natural disasters, and the opportunity that we have, I believe, as a country to be world leading in this domain. And economically, it makes a lot of sense. For every dollar invested in resilience, the estimates are that we will save between $4 and $11 in response and recovery. And we need to get off the treadmill of the focusing when there is a crisis to really focusing in on the off season. How do we make sure that these natural hazards never become large-scale disasters? And it's ever present. Thinking back to the Black Summer fires, thinking to the Perth Hills fires, the floods. This whole area is very personal, having been caught in the fires, in the Black Summer fires, with my two brothers and others. What I'd like to share with you is a model that we believe, I'm sure you can see that model that we believe can change the way that Australia and the world deals with resilience. And drawing on the UN Sendai framework and the National Risk Reduction Framework, which defines resilience as a function of the hazard, the exposure to the hazard and inherent vulnerability, whether it's environmental or socioeconomic vulnerability, that it's a function of those three things. And to lift resilience against natural disasters, we need to address all three. This is a system level problem, and there's no one entity in the national system or the global system that can solve for this. It requires governments coming together with the research sector, with industry, and with non-profits. A methodology that's been successfully used in other parts of the world to address these system level problems is this missions model. And the missions model famously was used as part of the Apollo program back in the late 60s to put someone on the moon. But fundamentally, it's about being evidence-based in defining an outcome, making that outcome quantifiable, and the time frame to deliver it be quantifiable, and then using first-order principles to break the problem down. And then in a true meritocracy, applying emerging science and technology and the best in the world, as well as commercial off-the-shelf products and services, as well as focusing on systemic blockers to change and cultural and social dimensions. It's mobilizing the best in an integrated framework and work program to lift resilience. So in accordance with that UN Sendai framework, we believe that the solution lies in focusing a mission specifically on hazards, specifically on communities, which is the vulnerability aspect, and on landscapes and our built environment, our natural environment, which is about exposure. What we've done is, over the course of 4 months, brought together 60 stakeholders across government, insurers, reinsurers, banks, telcos, and other stakeholders, non-profits as well, and built the evidence base, including the academy, built the evidence base for what are these first order principles that we need to address. And in the case of the hazard, we've focused on fire to begin with an audacious goal of being able to extinguish any dangerous fire within an hour by 2025. In the case of resilient communities, we want to lift Australia's 50 most vulnerable communities to be on par with the 50 most resilient communities. And in the case of healthy landscapes, halve exposure in our 50 most fire and flood prone regions. Now, obviously, this is a solution that no one organisation can deliver alone. And what the evidence base pointed to was an integrated work program of 70 projects, 11 work streams, folding up into these 3 missions. And what we've learnt along the way here is that there is an enormous amount of goodwill and interest and tremendous work going on, but it's highly fragmented. It's highly fragmented across the country, and a common framework is what's needed. So whether it's the Minderoo framework that ultimately becomes the framework or becomes part of the framework, or whether it's another national framework that emerges over time, with Minderoo's work program solving part of this. We think this is the only way to address the problem. The reason for doing it, first of all, a societal one. Part of our working group is Lifeline. They are today receiving 400 phone calls a day from people in fire-affected communities, and that number's growing because of the lag of impact here. The other reason to do it is environmental, and that's a huge motivator and driver, and a consequence of solving this problem and these missions around healthy landscape will be higher resolution instrumentation of landscapes, which could unlock new economic models for active land management. And the third reason for doing it is an economic one, and it's just the sheer cost, the economics of natural disasters and their impact on the country, as well as the fact that not just the economics, but the insurability. So if insurance is about moving risk, today about 11% of Australia's homes are uninsured, and 60% of the economic costs incurred through natural disasters are outside the bounds of insurance. So we need to come together. The time is right. It really is the time to step up, pull together as a country, and lift resilience systemically. There's a lot of international interest in solving this problem, whether it's from agencies like NASA through to nonprofits around the world, as well as corporates. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and have a lot of experience here now and in previous roles in making these mission models work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. A very, very interesting talk and an important call to arms for all of us. We are now going to turn to our second speaker, Mark Crosweller, Founder and Director of Ethical Intelligence and Senior Advisor to KPMG. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Tayanah. Good afternoon, everybody. And also thanks to Adrian for the opening comments, and I can only but agree, having had the great pleasure of working with Adrian from time to time over the last 12 months on his missions and some of the work being done more broadly in the private sector. And he makes the observation, I think very astutely, that the need for a unifying framework, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next 10 minutes, because it is certainly something that's missing and needs to be addressed. First and foremost, I think, before we can achieve any claim to success. But speaking of success, I think I always open up these talks by sort of reminding all of us, I think, that the greatest measure of success in this space in climate disaster risk is the upholding of public trust and confidence, and anyone who operates in the institutional framing, public or private, NGO or community, has that obligation to make sure that whatever it is that they do, that we uphold trust, because ultimately it's people trusting others that limits the vulnerability and limits the harms that would otherwise manifest. And speaking of harm, of course, the greatest mission is the reduction of human and non-human suffering. And what I mean by that is not only should we consider the human element in these matters of climate disaster risk, but we should also consider the non-human element of, the rivers, the forests, the trees, the plants, the ecosystems, the animals, all that makes up the Earth system essentially needs to be considered in the context of what it is that we do. And in the world of public policy, that's not a common view. Interestingly, it's a fragmented view. It's a view shared in parts of governments, or parts of the advice that's given to government might share collectively in that view, but it's not something that's coordinated. It's not a holistic perspective that's taken on the issue of climate disaster risk. Just to quickly move, I'm going to sort of take us through before the Black Summer fires that Adrian talked about, during the Black Fire Summers, and then afterwards, and just a little bit of context to work out where we're at and where I think the challenges are. And I think the first thing is that, the government saw fit to set up a resilience task force, a national resilience task force, which I had the great privilege of leading. And it did a number of things for the government. It was initiated by Prime Minister Turnbull, and it was continued by Prime Minister Morrison, initially under all the way through, actually, through the Department of Home Affairs. And it was to look at a national risk reduction framework, which was completed and endorsed without amendment across all Australian governments. It profiled Australia's vulnerability, so it took a systemic look at vulnerability and what were the systemic drivers and causes of vulnerability, and to Adrian's point about being a key aspect of risk. What did that actually look like? It looked at climate and disaster risk services information and how could that be best manifested across public and private realms, and how could knowledge be liberated for the benefit of the broader society. And it looked at decision-making processes around climate and disaster risk, and all of that was achieved in a 12-month period. So there were some good signals coming out of government of bringing together climate and disaster risk as a problem and a need for an integrated solution. Those frameworks were put together consulting over 140 people from 80 odd different organisations, many from the banking, finance and insurance sectors, many from the community sector and NGOs and other governments, of course. And so it really was a collaborative effort, and we could see that there was a lot of synergy in the issues and a lot of goodwill coming from all sectors of community to do something about climate disaster risk. So it was really quite encouraging. But what it wasn't able to achieve in its advice, and it was because it was time limited, was the pathways for collaboration between governments, businesses, NGOs and communities. That still remains problematic, actually. So the frameworks that Adrian talked about, the pathways and the networks, are still ambiguous, albeit some of the policy settings and some of the policy intentions are starting to crystallise quite favourably, I think. And there was a reticence and a hesitance towards narratives of climate change, but to the government's credit, it was opening its ears and its eyes to the problem of causation and the effect that climate change was having on the intensity and frequency of natural hazard events. So it was early days, of course, but there were some positive signs that we were starting to cut some new ground. What happened during the season? Look, I'll capture it this way. And I noticed this in my reflections of the 2020-2021 Black Summer. These were the messages coming out of government. Governments could do no more. Citizen safety could not be guaranteed. Losses would inevitably occur. Communities should prepare for catastrophic impacts. There would be the inevitability of death, and that citizens should follow instructions in abandoned localities. Now, the reason I raise that is because that's where we ended up in 2020, 2021. And the question going forward is that where we want to end up again? Because the intensity and the frequency of the disasters that we experienced in 2020, 2021 is the start of a trajectory. It's not a new normal, it's the start of a trajectory. So if those messages are coming out of government in the middle of a season that has worse to come, what does it look like into the future? So we go forward from there to the Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission accepted the advice from CSIRO, the Bureau and others about climate change. I think it accepted it uncontested. It certainly contested the evidence, but it accepted in full the advice that was being given. It accepted the argument that disasters weren't natural, that disasters were as a result of the forces of nature intersecting with society and society's inability to cope with that force, its inability or its unwillingness to design those forces into the way we design societies. And it recognised the need for enhanced coordination, relief, recovery, resilience and risk reduction across the framework. So there was movement again. So the Royal Commission incentivised things around climate, around the need for collaboration, around the need for coordination, and we kept going. The Commonwealth responded in part to that, and it's essentially agreed to set up a new resilience agency, an enhanced emergency management Australia, crisis management and response type agency, and then an agency for disaster and climate risk information. So those three aspects of the response from the federal government are also encouraging. But here's the kicker. So whilst it all sounds good, and I think it is good, and I think it's progressive and it's coming together and it's opening up pathways, there's still a denial or a lack of regard for the institutional and systemic failures that continue to pop up in crisis. So when you take a lens across the Royal Commission or the New South Wales inquiry or the South Australian inquiry or the CSIRO report as examples, there are systemic failures in institutions that are not adequately stepping up and responding to the intensity, the frequency and the complexity of what climate and disasters are now producing. So we tend to focus on the hazard, and to Adrian's point, of course, there's three elements: hazard, risk and exposure. Hazard, vulnerability and exposure. But much of the discourse and much of the policy effort historically has been around hazard. It needs to shift into the institutional capabilities to deal with these things. The collaborative frameworks are not in place. They remain ambiguous and they continue to be danced around. I think part of the problem is that that will require, in order for them to be effective, a trading of the equities of power, wealth and resource. So we're going to have to somehow renegotiate some of those equities. Who holds the equities of power under legislation or otherwise, market forces? Who holds the equity of resource, and who holds the equity of funding, and so on and so forth. I think also what underpins it, and what's going to make resilience very difficult, is the economic, social and structural drivers that actually drive vulnerability to start with. So if we don't address adaptive capacity and vulnerability reduction, so we don't increase adaptive capacity and reduce vulnerability, then resilience will not be achievable. And whilst we can run down the road of resilience and try and make as many people resilient as possible to the forces that are coming our way, if we don't reduce the propensity for harm or the susceptibility to harm, if we don't reduce the causation of harm, then really resilience and adaptation particularly will struggle to manifest in any meaningful way. The difficulty when we look at that is in terms of the way the governments are structured and the way this whole framework is structured, is that we can't, and we don't have, reach into the drivers of economic, social and policy change. So we're dealing with it at one end, which is more towards the impact end. It's more towards the community end and the manifestation of those forces and what they're doing. And that's incredibly important and it can't be ignored, and there's plenty of work to be done there. But if you can't liberate as many people as possible to exercise as agency to the extent at which they are able and capable and willing, if they are constrained economically, socially or structurally, and can't meet those objectives or can't meet the standards the government set for them, then we are going to continue to fail in this space. And there seems to be a lot of conversation about the need for that reach, but there's almost no evidence of it turning up in our policy frameworks or our consulting frameworks and so on and so forth. So I think the last thing is we talk a lot about community, and those words have turned up again in advice to government in relation to the new resilience agency. No one's going to contest the need for community input, engagement and involvement. But again, it's hard to see the pathways where that will have any meaningful effect unless some of those equities are renegotiated, again, around power, wealth and resource. And there needs to be a deliberation and a contestability about public policy, and there needs to be a tuning into what's genuinely valuable. See, the two policy pillars in climate are adaptation and mitigation, of course. The third emerging policy pillar is loss and damage, which is much harder to talk about. That's where the questions of justice come in, of course. We need to understand what's at risk. You know, what are we likely to lose? What is it that we could possibly lose? So what does loss look like? In the context of loss, what's valuable? That's a big, complex, difficult community conversation. And from what's valuable, what's tradable and what's not tradable. And that's really the third area which we're going to have to explore in the policy space in order to get the balance between adaptation, mitigation and loss and damage. So Tayanah, I might leave it there, and we can take some questions a little bit later on.
Thank you so much, Mark. Inspiring and thoughtful as always. Next up, we have Kate Mackenzie, our climate finance and economics consultant. Although she doesn't just belong to us, she's world renowned, and we're delighted to have you along, Kate. So I'll hand over to you for your 10-minute presentation now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tayanah. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm speaking from Gadigal country in the Eora Nation, where sovereignty was never ceded. So hopefully I can sort of build a little on some of the things that Adrian and Mark were just talking about. It's really interesting sort of topic for a panel. I think you know, who does what and how. I think I think we're often not clear about what we mean about adaptation, and I don't mean the adaptation specialists who largely participating in this area and in this conference, but when adaptation reaches out into the sort of the broader world of decision makers in government and finance and community, it's not always completely clear. And as Mark was alluding to, I think this is really, saying very clearly, I think it's very important, what are we actually talking about protecting? Which things, which assets, and to what extent are ecological systems included in that as well. So I'll just touch on a few things about particularly how that relates to finance and economics, because I think that's probably where I can add the most, but I'm really interested to see where the discussion goes as well. So there's I think often a tendency to feel that adaptation is neglected in a lot of climate conversations, and in the last sort of year or two, I've been working, I guess, more generally across both the adaptation and mitigation side, after having spent a bit of time more focused on adaptation at Climate Kick. And I think it's really correct. I think that adaptation is neglected, and I think there are reasons for that. Partly to do with the fact that it is sort of far more, I think it's more conceptually complex for decision makers to deal with and sort of to prioritise and assess. On the previous panel, one of the panelists remarked that, we don't even really have language to talk about what the metrics or the measures of success are that would fit into a financial framework or from a financial perspective, and this was Zoe Witten, and she reflected that that itself is kind of indicative of where some of that conceptual gap is. And I think it's a good point, but I think it's also indicative of just how different adaptation is to mitigation. And in a lot of these realms where really big decisions are made, climate is addressed as one thing. So I think it's great. It's great that we are seeing a bit more enthusiasm of adaptation in private finance. That's something that I've particularly written about, I guess, and worked on over the last few years, is the intersection of adaptation and adaptation and impacts and private finance in particular. It's good to see that is happening. Sorry, I'm just going to start a timer for myself. It's good to see that that's happening, but we also have to be a bit careful what we wish for. I think in terms of those sort of like very high level policy decisions and really kind of big private finance entities and interests getting really excited about adaptation. How is it being defined? And what's included and what's not included. Often, I think I've noticed there's not always clarity on whether we're even talking about private finance or public finance on the I guess the sort of supply side, let alone what it is actually financing on the demand side. And I think some of that will come down to having the people, having the sort of the adaptation experts as much as possible being really explicit about what are the sort of power dimensions of the adaptation that you're talking about, what are the trade-offs, who's being protected, why, and what are the trade-offs, what's not being protected as well. I think that's really important, is to say, all of these decisions involve trade-offs, and it's sometimes sort of what is not being addressed that is really the important thing. And again, I think Mark's remarks were really, really touched on a lot of those issues, which you know, are often assumed to be, you know, everyone's on the same page, and that we're all sort of pursuing adaptation in you know, from a similar perspective, I guess. But you know, as Mark said, if when people are constrained economically and socially, we'll continue to fail on that. So I'll just talk for a couple more minutes about finance and then sort of leave it for Simon and the discussion. I don't subscribe to the idea that finance is the key to everything, or economics for that matter, but I do think that it helpfully can at least sort of demonstrate where the trade-offs are being made, and how priorities are being reached at. Again, as the previous panel sort of discussed, private finance is increasingly seen as a big part, or a really necessary and important part of tackling adaptation, or even of implementing adaptation measures, both in Australia and internationally. There is a, you know, rationale that there isn't enough public finance to adapt, so we'll need lots of private finance to come into it. That's actually really difficult, really challenging. I actually would argue that it's sort of fundamentally challenging proposition to privately finance adaptation, at least in the way that adaptation, I think, is commonly understood in the government sector and in the research sector, because private finance doesn't have the same incentives, I think, that those actors in research and government often have, and these are, you know, quite intrinsic things. One of the main projects I worked on at Climate Kick was trying to come up with a private finance framework for investing in adaptation, and it's really fundamentally difficult because finance wants things, private finance I'm talking about here, they really desire things to be to have low transaction costs, scalability, and those are really quite incompatible with adaptation, which is you know, largely very community based, very location specific, and requires, you know, a real granular treatment of, you know, what's being proposed, and what's achieved out of that. If you look around at the investment sector now, you will hear not necessarily adaptation being spoken about in that phrasing, but climate risk is talked about a lot, and I think and climate impact risk is how it's also sometimes described. That if you look at the letters from Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, which is the biggest asset manager in the world, that can be sort of quite illustrative of how private finance is thinking about it. He talks about how their research, I'm just reading off another screen, so excuse me, but yeah, he talks about how research from a range of organisations, including their own collaborations with Mackenzie and others, is deepening our understanding of how climate risk will impact our physical world and the global system that finances economic growth. And if you look at what they're doing, they're actually very much, BlackRock are very much kind of selling, or, you know, marketing their expertise in understanding climate risk and where that risk will occur. And that's not dissimilar to a lot of other firms as well, a lot of other financial management firms. But what that means, that doesn't necessarily mean adaptation. That means you exit your positions. So I think that's an important thing to sort of keep in mind, I guess, we're talking about private finance, is that private finance wants to have, wants to avoid risk primarily. And I think I'll leave it there because I think there's lots more to discuss, but look forward to hearing what Simon says. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks, Kate. For our final presentation before our group discussion, we have Simon Holmes Court, Senior Advisor and Board Member for a range of entities focused on energy. Over to you, Simon.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just getting my screen up and going. Great, thank you all. So I was when I was approached for this conference by Eleanor from Future Earth, I said that I'm not an adaptation guy. I'm in the mitigation space, so I'm not sure really what I've got to offer. But when in talking about it, I now know a lot more about adaptation and hopefully the perspectives I'm going to give on mitigation, which is obviously the other half of the other side of the coin. Hopefully they're going to be interesting to feed back into the conversations we've had so far. So I'm going to mainly focus on Australia, but the stories are fairly applicable world over. So mitigation turns out to be really, really easy. We just need to do two things: electrify everything and decarbonize our electricity. Obviously, it's a little bit harder than that, but the good news is that electricity is the largest single source of our emissions, the electricity sector, and the easiest one to decarbonize. We've got other sectors of the economy. Thankfully, the next two, direct combustion, which is what we use for heating buildings, for instance, or heating water, stationary energy, that and transport are also we have the technologies right now. We'll come back to this slide, but I want to talk about the largest sector, and that's electricity. We're doing pretty well in Australia. I actually, I claim, and I don't think I'm going out on a limb here, that we've passed the tipping point where the transition is more than inevitable. The transition is well underway, and it's accelerating. So you can see in this chart here, we've got coal is the black line. This is monthly data from 2005, and you can see coal was back in 2005 was about 90 to 93% of our electricity came from coal. It's heading down towards 60. Now over that time we had gas started at about 5%, went up to about 15, and it's down to levels we haven't seen this century actually in the quarter that's just completed. We are phasing out both coal and gas, and the renewables are shooting up. And we've seen in many other jurisdictions that once we get to this point, the curves steepen. All those curves steepen in the right direction. So it's really at this point it's no longer if or when, but how fast. And just to give some perspective in how fast things are moving, it was only 4 years ago, 3.5 actually, that Josh Frydenberg had commissioned Alan Finkel to write a review, the Finkel review into the energy sector, and out of that report, Finkel said that AEMO, the Energy Market Authority, he recommended, or one of his strongest recommendations was that AEMO put together an integrated system plan to talk about how quickly to analyse how quickly the system will change and make sure that we stay ahead of the technical challenges. It's amazing the difference that 3 years has made. So these are the 6 scenarios that Finkel presented in that report, 6 different emissions pathways that our electricity sector might go down. And he was proposing that, I think one of the green lines was his. Gee, I hadn't looked at this for a while. His was not the most ambitious pathway. But anyway, this was the sort of range of possibilities we could see just 3.5 years ago. This red line is AEMO's, their second integrated system plan, shows the trajectory that they think our electricity sector can travel down if we follow a certain set of, if we stick within a certain set of scenario parameters. And the good news is that we are ahead of this curve. We are moving faster than the step change scenario, which this is. So even what looked ambitious 3.5 years ago, we have eclipsed that, and I'm sure we will do that again. When we look back in 3 years, this line will look quaint. The integrated system plan step change scenario paints this picture as an achievable scenario for Australia, marginally more expensive than business as usual. The dark at the bottom is coal. The orangey colour is gas. And you can see hydro. So coal and gas, coal drops down dramatically. Most, really from the second half of this decade and the first half of next decade, is where most of it disappears from our grid. Gas plays an important but very small role. It's important for keeping the lights on, but we burn less of it rather than more in actually every one of AEMO scenarios. We're not counting on any expansion of hydro, but you can see that wind, being green, and solar, being yellow, end up being the major energy suppliers in our grid. You're past the 50% point well before the end of this decade. As I said before, the Clean Energy Regulator has determined that we are moving faster than step change. So that sort of business as usual is this blue line. Then orange is the step change scenario. We are on this dotted black. We are moving faster than we thought. And this step change scenario is not even a year old. Meanwhile, on our carbon policy, we still have nothing. While our trading partners and some of the world's most significant geopolitical players, Europe, UK, Japan, South Korea, China, and now the USA have all got on board with net zero targets. And we're starting to feel the pressure there, while Australia is one of the last Western jurisdictions not to have a net zero commitment. I put this up to show you where our thermal coal exports go. Now, 80% of Australia's coal is exported, and you can see that it's going to primarily Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, a tiny bit to India, and a significant amount to China. Now, Japan, South Korea, and China have all committed to net zero targets, which mean that they will phase coal out. We can expect them to phase seaborne coal, imported coal out, probably before 2040. And Taiwan is, I understand, debating net zero now. So I wouldn't be surprised if they join in the next year or so. Put this up to make the point that the Australian coal sector doesn't exist at the pleasure of our politicians, but rather at the decisions that determine the speed at which our coal sector phases down. Those decisions are made in Taipei, in Seoul, in Beijing, in Tokyo. I just want to show you that we spend a lot of time in Australia talking about the impact of coal on, or the end of coal on coal communities and coal workers. It's not a problem that we should ignore. It's not a challenge, rather, that we should ignore. It's something we need to do better than we've done for other industries. But I just want to point out that it's not going to be that hard, because it is actually a very small industry. Compare the size of it below at the bottom with the motor vehicle industry, an industry that we flushed out of Australia over about a 4 or 5 year period. The coal industry is going to phase out over a 10 to 20 year period. It's of a similar size, and it's going to get the political attention. There's not a lot of people. It's probably around about 40,000 people who will need to be transitioned. Either many are near retirement age, but many others will want to work in other industries, and most of them will already have transferable skills. But we can afford, as other countries like Germany has made a commitment in their energy transition, that no one will be forcibly put out of work, that a new job will be found. So the industry, we're lucky, is small enough. I'll just finish with this slide. Back again, I put this on before. Electricity, we're doing really well in. We've barely started on the direct combustion. We've got the technologies for that. Transport, we have the technologies for much of it. We don't have them for aviation or shipping yet. We're pretty sure we know what to do about shipping, and that's ammonia. But we very much know what to do about land transport, and Australia is very much behind on that one. A lot more work to do on agriculture. Fugitives are the emissions from coal and gas mining. So as demand falls off, those will fall away. And we have the technologies to deal with industry and much of the problems around waste. So I'll leave it to there, and we can move back to any of these topics in question time.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Great presentation, and thank you indeed to all of our panelists for all of your insights and perspectives. We're now going to move to a group discussion. We have about 10 to 15 minutes between the panelists, and then another 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. Panelists, I'll get you all please to turn on your cameras and your microphones. And for those in the virtual room, can you please start to input, if you have not already done so, please input your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'd appreciate that to keep the discussion going. Although I think there's lots for us to talk about. I'm going to kick off with a question. The question is, who decides what success looks like? And I'd like to orient that question with respect to some comments made by Mark, but peppered throughout all four presentations, which were really looking at the economic, social and structural pathways that work well, the ones that need to change, how we think about power, wealth and resources, and particularly how we are thinking through what the trade-offs will be as we move through this resilience and adaptation lifestyle that we all now find ourselves in. So open floor, if anyone would like to go first. Happy to take some responses to that.
I can maybe start. So we're talking about a systemic problem, and we're talking about really counter to human behavior of we're not wired to really prepare and invest ahead of the crisis, but we're quick to respond to it, and we'll invest heavily in it in all dimensions, in all ways. And the biggest challenge that we're finding, so spanning industry, and I just came from a meeting this morning with one of the biggest reinsurers in the world. So on the economic side, but also with government that works in political cycles. How do we shift the conversation to preventative measures? And if I think about other systemic industries where this has happened, one I've spent a lot of time in and around is cybersecurity, which is a form of risk. It's a form of networked risk and a form of systemic risk. And what shifted that was regulatory drivers, but what also shifted that was measurement and transparency around risk. And back to common ways to measure, I think what would be good to turn up the volume on in these sort of conversations is the curves of science and technology. So if you think about, a company like SpaceX, low Earth orbit satellites will be up and operational in the next 3 or 4 months, offering global coverage. And there's work to do in terms of the sensor technology and the payloads, but you've got a company that has the capability to refresh an entire satellite fleet every 4 years. It's not dissimilar to a cell phone upgrade. So I'm optimistic that in the same way we saw the curves steeper than anticipated around this transition to renewables, that we may be underestimating the role of science and technology and the ability to impact and bring, measure and bring transparency to this whole problem space.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Any other thoughts or comments on what success looks like and who decides from the panel?
So I think to Adrian's point, Tayanah, I think absolutely the truth telling needs to be front and centre here, and measurement and data and knowledge and insight is fundamental. I think one of the constraints in that space is much of the knowledge around climate and disaster risk is privileged or elite, and we still can't share it. We still can't release it for a whole host of human reasons. So if you take a broader view of benefit, ecological, social, environmental benefits and so on and so forth, then there's little reason to withhold the knowledge that we currently have. But when it becomes about us, when it becomes anthropocentric, we put up a whole lot of barriers as to why we won't talk about these things and why we won't release them. So I think truth telling and getting the measurements in place and looking at the trends and helping to shape people's views and opinions and beliefs is really, really important. But there's also many factors that work against it. I think what this conversation has done, what a number of conversations have done, particularly since Black Summer, has really opened up opportunities for people like Minderoo, organisations like Minderoo and others to really come in with some innovative thinking and insight, ways of doing things, which the public sector has been quite constrained on. But the public sector equally, I think, has underestimated its capacity to rectify some of those economic, social and structural drivers and frameworks that can actually make the difference. If it's a market force alone that drives these things, or science and technology alone, then it doesn't actually do with questions of justice, the distribution of equities. Not everybody can participate in this space, but we want as many people as possible to do so. So it, in my mind, always comes back, and Adrian made this point right up front, comes back to the frameworks and the collaborative spaces, the ethics that underpin it, the justice that's required in order to be exercised. Those things need to be reworked and reshaped and rediscovered, I think, to make this the most effective way of moving forward. And there's more than enough evidence in the sentiment of the Australian community to say there's been a fundamental shift. I mean, to Simon's points on the trends in the marketplace and elsewhere, they're compelling. Well, the sentiment of Australians is compelling as well. There are only small sectors of this collaborative space that are withholding or withdrawing from this conversation, that most Australians now agree unambiguously about the climate change is happening and there's a need to do something about it. So I really think that at the leadership level, the leaders who actually embrace that sentiment and move past any notions of potential vested interest or whatever will be on a winner. And all the indicators are there. I don't personally, I don't understand why there's still so much pushback and withdrawal and holding back from this space, because it is definitely now the minority view.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. I think there's a big disconnect between where the public sentiment is, I think, to an extent, about climate generally, and obviously where politics are in this country at the federal level in particular. I think another important point that Mark just made there was about vested interests and so forth. And, we can't really tackle these problems unless we're going to be very open and frank that actually not in the interests of, some parts of society to make these changes in a just way. Third point I want to make is that I don't think there's an equivalence between mitigation and adaptation. I think, it would be nice, but it's just wishful thinking to say, we can expect these sorts of technological breakthroughs or whatever to kind of come to the rescue in the same way that it has done with mitigation. I think adaptation is sort of fundamentally a different proposition, both sort of at a social level and at a technical level. And I think, on the mitigation side, I'm interested to hear Simon's view of this. I think on the mitigation side, the initial stages of energy transition are possible to kind of implement and tackle without, necessarily explicitly acknowledging sort of justice and equity considerations. So I don't, and the later stages are not. But I don't think you can say that even about the early stages of adaptation. And I think actually, Tayanah, your research, your PhD thesis was an illustration of how those tensions are very explicit very early on between, property owners and, you know, and the different sorts of interests that they might have to the broader community, for example.
Thanks, Kate. Simon?
Yeah, I'm getting a sense of just how much more difficult adaptation, or how much more complex it is than mitigation. One message that I keep hearing about mitigation that I buck up against is, I heard a senior politician say earlier this week that this energy transition we're going through is going to be bigger than the industrial, you know, it's the biggest thing since the Industrial Revolution, that it's going to change the world as we know it. And on the mitigation front, on this energy transition, I actually think most of us won't notice. Most of it, you know, the where we will intersect with it, where, you know, you might get a better car and you'll get cleaner air, but I can think of all the inventions that have happened in the last 100 years that have fundamentally changed our society, that we didn't ask for, we didn't fear, they just happened, such as mobile phones or computers or the internet or aviation or antibiotics, internal combustion engine. These innovations turned our world upside down, whereas decarbonising the energy system is not going to be traumatic. In fact, for 99% of the population, it's they won't even notice it. For a small part of the population, there'll be a whole bunch of extra new jobs, and a small part of the a very small part of the population, there'll be we have to move people out of dying industries into new ones, or into existing ones, more likely. But I don't think we have that luxury with as we start seeing collapses in food production systems, or we start seeing weather systems, climate-induced events like bushfires. You can't, they affect they affect all those who live within or near those events. So the adaptation side is we focus, I think, too much on the disruption from mitigation, and I hear what others say, that it's not going to be as easy on the adaptation side.
Thanks, Simon. And indeed, there is that. I think I talked with you yesterday about the yin and the yang between mitigation and adaptation, and both sides aren't always visible, but they're ever present, and both are critical. And with adaptation, as we're seeing in this discussion, the complexity and the iterative nature of what adaptation means and what it will be doing as we are experiencing climate impacts makes it highly complex. And there are no easy answers, or a rule book, or a framework, or a singular issue or opportunity or response that can tick the box to say, okay, we've done adaptation now. It's something that we will be living with, and getting comfortable with the complexity, I suppose, is part of the challenge. I'm going to take some questions from the Q&A, and there's one here that feeds very nicely into what we've just been discussing here as a panel. It's from Mark. It says, Simon shows the dramatic nature of a tipping point in renewable energy. What would be the equivalent tipping point for adaptation / resilience to move as acceleratingly quickly? Who would like to go first? Adrian, you turned your mic off. Can I turn to you?
I was just going to say, I'm struggling to answer that question simply, for the reason that there's not a consistent language, taxonomy, framework, measurement system. So we've gone to first order principles to say, well, around hazards, there's earlier detection is a big thing. Better prediction, modeling about the impact, societally, economically, environmentally. All of that is spatial. It's spatial intelligence. So the tipping point for me would be convincing these low Earth orbit satellite companies, just as media companies allocate some of their spectrum to public good community service announcements and other things and programming, to have payload on those to stand up a global network for public good. That would be, call it disaster watch, call it something else. That would have, people would have the ability to source that data. So this truth telling that Mark talks about, and to be able to innovate around it. Because if we don't have the data, if we don't have the measurement systems, we can't make the decision, the right sort of decisions. And, you know, I feel strongly, because I've been in the space, that we can't rely on mitigation. It's necessary. It's actually going to the root cause of the problem, and it's the most fundamental important thing to do. But between now and then, we're staring down the barrel as an initiative of fanning out on 4 fronts right now, whether it's Black Summer fires, Perth Hill fires, you know, floods, and those events are going to continue to happen, and with more frequency, and they're going to be more extreme.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. And it's an important point that we've already got some locked in climate change. So we need to mitigate fast, but we as a society will need to adapt regardless. Mark, you turned your mic off at the same time as Adrian, although I went to Adrian first. I'd invite you to perhaps comment on this question. What is the equivalent tipping point, or perhaps there's more than one, for adaptation resilience?
Yeah, I think there is more than one. And Mark raises a really good question. I think going back to what I said earlier about the third policy pillar that we're now, you know, moving into, which is the notion of loss and damage, the acceptance of the inevitability of these events, and the acceptance of the inevitability that we're going to lose things. Whether the psyche is that I don't want to lose anything, therefore nothing should be lost, but we don't have the power to do that. When we can shape a narrative that says to people, look, you know, we're going to have to trade off here, and we're going to have to understand that trade-off in the context of what's actually valuable, and how do you determine what's valuable, who determines what's valuable, and what measures do you give it, what processes do you put in place, what participative arrangements are put in place so that people can express that is fundamental. Because I've said this for a long time in the course of my career, crisis, disasters, you know, climate impacts are much more a matter of the heart than the head. And you need both. You need both, but the sentiments around this and how people feel about it is equally as important as what they think. When it becomes more personal and more contextualised, and to your point about adaptation being localised, and it is very much about, you know, local input, local design, local commitment. When we see systemic commitments to those approaches, and we see some of the equities of power, wealth and resource traded in that regard, so people do have choice, that they can exercise some power, they can access government systems and other systems in order to do these things properly and be participative in those processes, then we'll see the tipping points. But at the moment, the power is still held at the top. The equities are not properly distributed. You know, the wealth is not where it needs to be, and so it goes on. So the rhetoric's there, the rhetoric's in the public policy positioning, in the crafting of those policies, in the consultation processes, in the press releases, but it's not underpinned by action. And so until we can get into that level and really get to the nitty gritty of what is valuable for people and how that's decided and who decides, and then what can be done about it, there are your tipping points. Because at the moment, these decisions are so far away from people, so far away, they feel helpless and powerless to do anything about it. And the rhetoric is not enough. It just isn't. It sounds great. You know, you listen to the rhetoric that comes out of these workshops and it's awesome. You think, yes, that's where we need to go. But all the equities to make that happen don't shift. They just don't shift, and they're going to have to shift.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly, as was evidenced by my vigorous nodding. Thank you for those thoughts. We've got another question here. It's directed to yourself, Mark, and others, but Kate, I'm going to throw it to you first. I'll read it out for the virtual room. It's from Susie. Susie says, great presentations. Thank you. Responding to Mark's point about the lack of clear pathways for coordinated action, particularly around addressing community resilience and the drivers of harm or vulnerability. Does anyone, Mark or others, but Kate, throwing to you, have ideas around how to progress this pathway in a collaborative way? And where are you seeing promising work in this space, if indeed you are seeing promising work? Thanks, Kate.
Oh, that's a really hard question. Thank you. No, it's a good question though. Yeah, I don't know. I think like I remember I spoke at a local government association of Queensland forum maybe 3 or 4 years ago, just to kind of basically to make the sort of proposal or suggestion that that bringing in private finance, not bring them in, but kind of maybe working with them in a more sort of strategic way might be a way to get a bit more leverage with sort of local resilience. So, you know, insurers are interesting in that way. And I think a lot of us here have you know, worked sort of or encountered the insurance sector in the course of the adaptation work that we've done. They're interesting in that they do have a bit of a kind of natural incentive to try and increase resilience. Unfortunately, I think like the promise of that potential hasn't been realised very well, and I'm not quite sure why. But you know, I still think, you know, there's maybe some possibilities there. I think it probably does require a bit of I am starting to feel like like information will be part of sort of unlocking that, and a kind of a clarity around what climate change will mean for local communities. And I know that's been something that's been really kind of suppressed or avoided in certain communities because, you know, people are unwilling to you know, people fear property price effects and things like this, you know, as we all are familiar with. I think that might be a way forward. I think with energy transition, one of the things that's been helpful in sort of galvanizing action is that it's such a clear-cut proposition relative to adaptation. So you know, if it can be made sort of more clear and more explicit without a fear of this sort of political, you know, without this fear of like climate denialism, for example, you know, I think we just need to kind of completely let that go if we haven't already by now. I realize it's still an issue at a political level, but I think not so much at the community level. Yeah, so you know, I do a little bit share Adrian's optimism about some of that information, you know, some of those data sort of possibilities, but I in terms of kind of achieving that that sort of clarity, but I would also echo what Mark said about the access to that information being really important. There was a proposal there's a proposal from an American academic about how to sort of do this climate risk information on a local or sort of state-based level, which I think, you know, I found really interesting, and it would be great to see what Australia can do in that regard, because it is so location specific and community specific.
Thanks,
just building on that. I mean, we're developing right now a tool that will allow somebody to type in their address and then take satellite imagery, take a history around the hazard, look at vegetation, use things like hyperspectral imaging for vegetation mapping to say, for your property, here's 15 things that you could do to lift resilience. And that's a hyper-local plan that could be scaled nationally. The other thing that comes to mind, just building off some of the previous comments, which I agree with around community involvement and engagement. RFS is the biggest volunteer organisation in the world, you know, roughly 70-odd thousand members. Mark would know better. But why don't we have a nationally consistent training and certification program? Because not everyone wants to hold a fire hose and fight fires, but we need people to do that. But what about common frameworks at community level to be able to lift resilience in the off season? That's something that we could do that would get communities engaged in the conversation, that would also drive on the ground changes, and combined with the access to data, and would put pressure on those data custodians like governments to release data, so that we could make better local decisions. But I think from what I've seen, it's got to be, people have got to get involved. There can't be an empathy around this. People have to lean up into, communities need to lean into this whole area of adaptation.
I think, Tayanah, it's also and supporting all of those points absolutely without qualification. I think in a leadership context, it is in every sense of the word relational. You know, if I take the view that I don't suffer but you do, or you might, then there's no relationship there. I think at the end of the day, there's a precariousness to this, that the world is vulnerable in this space. There's not a living being or a non-living being that we depend upon that is not vulnerable to the effects of climate. That's not vulnerable to the effects of natural hazard impacts. And really, if you really get, you know, cut to the chase, does any human being want to see themselves or someone or something suffer? And the answer is no, they don't. If you really cut to the chase, if you really run that argument to ground, that's not what people want to see. And that's a conversation that's so difficult to have because it's questions of scale and politics and power and all the discomforts that come with those things. But at the heart of this is the fact that nobody escapes the possibility or the propensity to be vulnerable. And somehow we've got to embrace that conversation in community around climate disaster risk and say, well, what does that actually look like? You can't negate vulnerability. It needs to be minimised and managed. But the minute it's disavowed or it's ignored, we're actually perpetuating the problem. And so much of leadership walks away from the word and walks away from the possibility. It just walks away from it because it's just uncomfortable. They might have to trade something that they're not willing to trade on. Or they might have to expose themselves in a way that they've never shown somebody before. And so vulnerability, yes, minimised and managed, absolutely. Disavowed and ignored, very dangerous. Very dangerous. And I see that time and time again, of the walking away from the vulnerable aspects of everything, of something that we all face to varying degrees with varying capacities for adaptation and management and so, and, you know, and resilience and so on and so forth. But the minute it's disavowed or denied, we're in trouble.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take another question, and it's from Marie, and she's following on from both your talks, Adrian and Mark, but I might open the floor to you first, Simon, and then we can continue this because the question is, I think, very relevant to the discussion we've just been having. So her comment and question is, following some of the panelists' talks, she has noticed not a lot of consideration has been given to mental health, particularly in the context of adaptation. She, like many of us, directly experienced the Black Summer fires. She felt that she coped at the time, but is now much more shaky than she was then, and is perhaps not coping as well as first realised, particularly as we are now coming into another potentially high-risk summer. Marie is interested in any comments or thoughts on where supporting and extending mental health capacity and resilience fits in with the other considerations. Now, I know, Simon, you're an energy guy, but I'd be interested if you have any perspectives on this, and then we can open to the panel.
And here we go. I'm very sympathetic to that. Look, I don't have any answers, but we tend to measure, you know, all the metrics that we had during the bushfires of hectares burnt, homes or structures destroyed, or firefighters deployed, dollars of damage. All those metrics, none of them captured the trauma that we as a country went through, you know, of course, there are many who are still, you know, sifting through, you know, all the impacts of that personally. But as a nation, so many of us sort of shut down and were glued to the news. Yeah, I think it's really just to say it's a really good point that we have to look beyond those standard metrics and recognise that the present threats, but also the loss of place or the loss of familiarity or the loss of safety has a massive impact on our quality of life. So yeah, I think that there definitely needs to be a focus on mental health for those directly affected, but also for the whole community who watched on.
So I think, Tayanah, it goes back to what's valuable. Mental health is valuable. A sense of place, a sense of identity, relic, artifact, memory, future. Those things are, in all my 36 years in this business, nobody ever measured risk by likelihood and consequence in the public space. It was always measured by what people value. What they valued was what was at risk. And how we measure value, generally economically or in commensurable terms, in fiscal terms or in terms of numbers, we can't adequately measure it any other way. But that's not where most people go when they experience loss and trauma. The numbers are important. They're important for a whole host of reasons. It's not a binary issue. But the sentiments are equally, if not more so, important depending upon the circumstance. The other thing I would say that the thing that alleviated a lot of mental health trauma was the dispelling of ignorance before an event. The more, and it goes to Adrian's point, Simon's point, and Kate's point, the more we can be honest about this and have it expressed in sensitive and comprehensive and truthful terms, it gives people greater choice about what they might do about it. The thing in all my career, people would say, you know what, as hard as that was, that thing accorded with my expectation. That's what I thought would happen. So when something happens that you thought would happen, it's hard, but it's not as hard as I never thought that would happen. And I've heard throughout, particularly the last 2 years, this notion of unprecedented, and I need to disavow this once and for all. The unprecedented nature of last summer has some statistical relevance in terms of the numbers, you know, size, scale, duration, whatever. In terms of expectation, not unprecedented at all. We've been talking about these impacts and effects for 20 years or more. Almost my entire career, we've talked about the potentiality of nature to do what she did 18 months ago. And yet we use the word unprecedented as an excuse for not preparing adequately. Now, we're all complicit in that to varying degrees, not the same degree, but we've all participated in that complicity about being surprised. But we've got to be more realistic and honest about what it is that we're facing, what's at risk in context of what's valuable, and value needs to extend itself far beyond the economics. And then we can start to alleviate some of the mental health distress. We can start to move into those spaces of value that we have not touched upon in the public policy sense or the investment sense or the community interest sense. Those things not explored before a disaster will turn up in their droves after one. And here's the rub, that the propensity to be vulnerable and to have lost something always existed. It was always there, we just hadn't explored it. Disasters don't cause anything other than an exposure to what it is we didn't know or chose not to know. So those things we chose to sit in ignorance get flushed out unambiguously so for the world to see.
Thank you so much, Mark. We've gone slightly over time, so unfortunately we're going to have to call it a close on that final point, very critical and important point. As with all of our previous sessions, both yesterday and today, we could continue to talk about this for many, many hours and days, but we are out of time. A major thank you to all of you, our panelists, for giving us your time and sharing your time and expertise with the virtual room today. We so appreciate it. We will reconvene at 2:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time for our next session on frameworks to enable success. And we look forward to hearing more questions from the audience then. Thank you again, panelists. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tayanah.